Tyler Perry wasn't supposed to be the one to shake up the BET Awards that night. Most people tuned in expecting the usual: red carpet glamour, big performances, and a few viral celebrity moments. But instead, they got something raw, something real, and something entirely unexpected. Perry, known more for his calm demeanor and generosity than for controversy, took the stage and gave a speech that sounded less like a tribute and more like a reckoning. He didn't shout. He didn't name names. But his words cut deep, especially for those who knew the backstory. Without directly mentioning Meghan Markle, Perry told a story that clearly pointed in her direction about extending his home, his resources, and his heart to someone in need, only to be left feeling used, ignored, and ultimately discarded. To understand how powerful this moment was, you have to go back to 2020. That was the year Prince Harry and Meghan Markle made headlines around the world by stepping back from royal duties. They were in the middle of a media storm, seemingly isolated and vulnerable. When few others would help, Tyler Perry stepped in. He didn't just offer kind words. He gave them a roof over their heads. He opened the doors to his $18 million mansion in Beverly Hills, paid for private security, and supported them as they transitioned to life in the U.S. At the time, it looked like a noble gesture from a man who understood how fame can turn brutal. But according to Perry's speech and sources close to him, that act of generosity turned into something that drained him both emotionally and financially. He didn't go into specific details at the BET Awards, but he said enough. He talked about offering help to someone who accepted it gratefully, and then vanished. Some folks borrow blessings like they're owed, but never return the favor, he said. That line alone sent shockwaves through the room and the internet alike. Behind the scenes, the situation was more complex. Sources say the turning point came when Meghan asked to use Perry's private jet. Casually, without discussing costs or logistics. When Perry declined, not because he couldn't afford it, but because he started to feel like he was being taken advantage of, Meghan allegedly didn't take it well. That moment reportedly broke something in him. What had started as an act of friendship began to feel transactional, even exploitative. People around Perry, his colleagues, his staff, even fellow producers, began to warn him. Meghan doesn't return favors. She stores them up, uses them when convenient, and walks away when they're no longer useful to her narrative. Still, Perry tried to ignore the warning signs. He wanted to believe he was doing the right thing by helping Harry and Meghan find their footing in a new country. But as the media deals rolled in, Netflix, Spotify, and more, and as the couple's public profile soared, Perry never saw any real appreciation or attempt to give back. Silence, not gratitude, became the norm. That's what made Perry's speech so impactful. It wasn't a tabloid story or a royal family smear. It was a trusted, respected man saying publicly that he'd had enough. And the fallout was immediate. Meghan had built much of her public brand around being a misunderstood woman wronged by the monarchy and unfairly judged by the press. Tyler Perry had once supported that narrative. But he wasn't the palace, and he wasn't the press. He was the man who gave them shelter when they had nowhere else to go. And now, he was the one saying she crossed a line. The timing couldn't have been worse for Meghan and Harry. They had just started pitching a new documentary focused on themes of power and freedom. But suddenly Perry's speech changed the temperature in the room. Investors who had been interested began backing away. One producer reportedly pulled out just hours after the BET Awards aired. Another investor who had sat in on meetings bluntly said, "I don't want to be involved in something that feels this toxic." This wasn't about the content of their new project. It was about their credibility. Meghan's name, once seen as a progressive and inclusive asset, was quickly becoming a caution flag. Inside Archewell, her PR team scrambled. They tried to spin the story, reaching out to journalists and outlets to portray Perry as out of touch or overly emotional. They offered exclusive interviews, behind-the-scenes access, even hinted at a podcast rebuttal, anything to take control of the narrative. But none of it landed. The harder they pushed, the more desperate it looked. Instead of fixing the situation, it fueled more speculation. Why were they trying so hard to discredit a man who had only ever helped them? Tyler Perry's speech didn't just rattle one evening's entertainment news cycle. It shifted public perception. A man known for kindness, privacy, and generosity had finally broken his silence. And in doing so, he forced people to re-examine a story that had, for years, only been told from one side. In the end, Perry didn't just speak up. He changed the entire conversation, not with accusations, but with hard-earned disappointment. He wasn't the enemy. He was the friend who had done everything right and still got burned. And in Hollywood, that's the kind of story that sticks, and that changed everything. Within 24 hours of the speech airing, the mood in entertainment circles had shifted. Producers who once boasted about working with Meghan and Harry were suddenly quiet. Those who were mid-negotiation for projects involving the couple paused or pulled out entirely. The message was clear. If Tyler Perry, a man famous for loyalty and discretion, was willing to hint at betrayal, others began to question what they were getting involved in. What people underestimated was Perry's power. This wasn't just an actor with a grudge. This was a man who owned his own studio, who had built an empire from the ground up without playing the usual Hollywood games. When someone like him speaks, especially so candidly, it doesn't just ruffle feathers. It sends shockwaves through rooms most people never even get to enter. Industry insiders began whispering that Perry's comments confirmed what some already suspected, but were too cautious to say. Meghan and Harry were starting to look like a high-maintenance brand. One producer described them as PR intensive, a polite industry code word for more trouble than they're worth. With each new headline, the couple's value shifted, not in terms of fame, which they still had in abundance, but in trust. And trust is everything in Hollywood. Behind the scenes, Archewell, their nonprofit and media umbrella, went into crisis mode. PR experts were brought in, advisors were reshuffled. The team worked overtime trying to repaint Perry's comments as a misunderstanding. The problem was, they had no proof he was wrong. They couldn't deny that Perry had offered his home, his protection, his connections. They couldn't argue he hadn't been a real ally. The facts were on his side, and their spin attempts only deepened public suspicion. Some of Meghan's previous defenders started reconsidering their stance. Journalists who had once written glowing profiles of her began asking more pointed questions. Why hadn't Perry been acknowledged more publicly for his help? Why had someone so central to their U.S. transition been quietly sidelined? The narrative started to fracture. Meanwhile, more subtle signs of distance appeared. A prominent director who had been in talks to collaborate on the couple's Netflix project quietly removed himself from the lineup. At a major media conference, their names, once a draw on promotional materials, were suddenly omitted from a panel list. Nothing was said outright, but in an industry where silence speaks volumes, it was loud. And while Meghan's team tried to recover, Perry said nothing else publicly. That silence made his words even louder. He had said his piece and walked away, which, for many, made it seem even more authentic. He wasn't chasing the spotlight. He didn't want revenge. He simply told his truth and let it land. But privately, people close to Perry said he was relieved. He had kept that frustration to himself for years. According to insiders, it wasn't just the financial burden or the emotional letdown, it was the pattern. Time and again, he had defended the couple in rooms where others mocked or doubted them. And yet, when he quietly pulled away, not a word of thanks or acknowledgement followed. Just distance. That's when more stories began to surface. From others who had worked with or supported the Sussexes early on, only to be quietly dropped later. One executive who had helped broker their initial conversations with Netflix mentioned that after the deal closed, he never heard from them again. Another described trying to reach out for a follow-up project, only to be blocked by layers of handlers and ignored. It painted a picture of two people so focused on controlling their narrative that they had lost track of the relationships that made that narrative possible in the first place. Meanwhile, Tyler Perry continued doing what he always does, working quietly, building, supporting others. His phone didn't stop ringing. If anything, more people wanted to collaborate with him now. People saw him as someone with integrity, someone unafraid to say enough when boundaries are crossed, no matter who the person on the other side is. What made this story even more compelling was the contrast. Meghan had long positioned herself as someone who was silenced, misunderstood, and left unprotected. And for a while, the world believed it. But when someone like Perry, who had given her a platform, privacy, and protection, said that he had been the one left behind, it forced a new reckoning. The damage wasn't just reputational. There were real consequences. Investment interest in their upcoming projects declined. Their once guaranteed appeal to streaming services now required justification. Everything became conditional. And the most painful blow of all? One of their last real allies in the business, someone with both influence and heart, was gone. And Perry wasn't coming back. In Hollywood, where fake friendships are common and silence is currency, Perry's decision to speak out wasn't just rare, it was seismic. It reminded everyone watching that kindness has limits, that loyalty must go both ways, and that even the most carefully managed public image can collapse under the weight of unspoken truths. The fallout from Perry's speech wasn't a scandal. It was a revelation. A quiet man had finally spoken. And the world listened. At Archwell, reality had started to set in. Meghan and Harry weren't just dealing with a temporary PR hiccup, they were facing the long-term consequences of burned bridges. Hollywood is a town built on favors, on mutual benefit, on the idea that you help someone today because you never know who will hold the power tomorrow. And now, thanks to Perry's testimony, the perception was shifting. Meghan didn't uphold that code. She moved on, and she rarely circled back. For Harry, the situation was more complicated. While Perry's remarks mostly focused on Meghan, insiders say the fallout affected him just as deeply. Perry had treated them both as a unit. He didn't just offer help to Meghan, he opened his home and life to Harry as well. And Harry, by staying silent and allowing that distance to grow unchecked, was now seen by some as complicit. Not malicious, perhaps, but passive. And in situations like this, passivity isn't neutral. It becomes part of the problem. The couple's new Netflix project, a documentary about power, freedom, and resilience, quietly fell apart. The investors had backed away, the production team disbanded. And while nothing was ever officially canceled, the project effectively died from neglect. No one wanted to touch it. No one wanted to defend it. Meanwhile, Meghan's efforts to salvage her public image felt increasingly out of step with the reality behind the scenes. She released a few carefully curated videos, posted inspirational quotes, and tried to pivot toward empowerment campaigns. But the energy was off. People were no longer just questioning the royal family's treatment of her. They were now questioning how she treated those who helped her escape it. In the background, Perry continued doing what he had always done, producing, mentoring, creating space for others. But something had changed. Not in his work, but in how people saw him. There was a quiet reverence now, not just for his success, but for his honesty. He had drawn a line not out of spite, but out of principle, and people respected him more for it. A few months after the awards show, Perry was asked in an interview if he regretted speaking out. He smiled, paused, and simply said, "No. I needed to say it for me, and I hope it was heard the way it was meant." That was all. No bitterness, no elaboration, just closure. And that, in the end, is where the story settles. Not in scandal, not in spectacle, but in a quiet rebalancing of truth and illusion. Meghan and Harry didn't fall apart. They still had fans, still had opportunities, but they no longer had the unshakable goodwill they once enjoyed. People were more cautious, more reserved. Their names, once automatic green lights for partnerships, now came with whispered caveats. Make sure there's follow-through. Don't get too close. Don't expect it to last. Perry's story wasn't about tearing anyone down. It was about boundaries, about the cost of giving without reciprocity. And in telling it, he reminded a world obsessed with appearances that what happens behind closed doors always matters more than what gets posted online. In the end, the fairy tale didn't shatter. It just got rewritten. Not by tabloids, not by palace insiders, but by the one man who saw it up close, opened his doors to it, and finally walked away when the gratitude never came. That's not drama. That's just the truth. And sometimes the truth is the most powerful story of all.